The following is a keynote speaker presentation from the ACM 97 conference, The Next 50 Years of Computing. ACM 97 brought together over 2,000 leaders and luminaries from all aspects of the computing world to discuss and predict what the next 50 years of computing has in store. ACM 97 underwriters were Computerworld, Hewlett-Packard, Intel, Microsoft, and Sun Microsystems. Sponsors were Cadmus Journal Services, IBM, Netscape, Popular Science, Sheridan Printing Company Incorporated, Silicon Graphics Incorporated, SoftBank, and Unisys. The event also included a major exposition with a paleotechnic look back to the future from the year 2047, and a specially commissioned book, Beyond Calculation, featuring essays on the next 50 years of computing by luminaries and pioneers in the field. The ACM 97 conference was chaired by Robert Metcalf and emceed by James Burke. Details on how to obtain more information on ACM 97 follow this program.
Ladies and gentlemen, James Burke.
Our last speaker today, I bet you're sorry that's a fact, is somebody you could say lives in a kind of fantasy world, but unlike the rest of us, he gets to live out his fantasies. That's until we all get our intelligent agents. Mind you, for him it wasn't always that way. He started out, like all good and serious people, at MIT. And then at the age of 25, everything goes wrong. He sets up a company specializing in research and development, creative design, engineering, and systems for the visual and performing arts, so there goes a good education. At the same time, he starts consulting for Walt Disney Imagineering when they buy his company, and in 1993, he joins them. By this time, he's an internationally acclaimed designer technologist working in theater, film, special effects, architecture, and the sciences. In 1995, he becomes Executive Vice President for Creative Technology and R&D. Now, what all this means is that if you've ever seen Star Trek V or heard of theme parks like the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror, Honey, I Shrunk the Audience, there's a thought, or the Indiana Jones Adventure, well, guess who? Of course, there's always also the world of film, with work on titles and special effects in such biggies as Ken Russell's Altered States, Frank Oz's Little Shop of Horrors, Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, and many others. He has, of course, won prizes up the yin-yang for everything from computer-controlled lighting to the advanced concept optical printer to his own film, Funny. He's a member of the Motion Picture Arts Academy, and he's on the US Army Science Board. That one I don't get, but never mind. One of the things he does a great deal of, however, is this. I mean, he's spoken to just about everybody over the last few years in the entertainment, business, and scientific communities. But having said that, I must say that when you're preparing for a conference involving him, he is the world's most elusive speaker when you're supposed to be introducing him. That is to say, although I think he's going to talk about the long-term impact of information technology on the entertainment industry and the whole business of future styles in storytelling, who knows? I just hope he's still here. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome for Bran Ferren.
Thank you, and I've asked to have the lights on. My goodness, there's no room for paper in this world of computing. Excuse me. I will initialize your hard disk, Nathan, for the next. Anyway, brace yourselves, because we're in a nice, intimate room, easy for us to all talk to and relate to each other. I'm going to give you something pretty state-of-the-art, nonlinear talk. And for me, I get a strange feeling, because I listened to the speakers, many of whom were friends this morning, and while I agree with an incredible amount of what's being said, and I think some of it's quite fascinating and provocative, I agree with it for completely different reasons, and it feels like I come from a different planet. So you're going to get a talk from a different planet. from a fundamentally different way of looking at this, of looking at why, when we take something like the World Wide Web and we say, well, why is it exploding? And personally, while I think all of the Moore's Law thing is cute and, kind of handy, and that interoperability was critical and some degree of standardization is nice and all of that connectivity, I think it's because the computer is just barely getting good enough to be used for storytelling. And you're going to hear a storyteller's perspective, because that's how I look at all of this. I eat, live, and breathe story. I think story is the most important thing. I disagree with my close friend Nathan that the first technology that made this all start was writing, because I think storytelling significantly predated it. And whether you call it myth or fable or those sorts of things, the technology of storytelling is a little bit about what I'm going to talk about relative to the next 50 years of computing. The first prediction is, I don't think that when you look back from 50 years that this is going to be thought of as being the information age. I think the information age will be an interesting little curiosity, a blip. I think it will be remembered as the storytelling age. And I think as these technologies get better, that will be proved. Now this will create some interesting problems for the ACM. Because just as the word machinery and association of storytelling machinery is starting to feel a little archaic, especially with what we know about software, and some people who believe that it's all going to be software. Should it be the Association of Storytelling Machinery, the ASM? Should it be the Association of Storytelling Software? Bad acronym. But what I would like to propose to you today is that if you take almost every single one of the things that people do with computers, if you look at it from the perspective of it being a storytelling tool rather than an information processing tool or a simple communications tool, that it becomes a lot clearer as to where it needs to go. And while I don't mean to diminish how interesting it is, the increase, the scaling, how much more processor power there'll be and memory and all of that, because I find that all extraordinary, I guess every time I hear that, I ask myself, who cares? What are these things going to do that are going to make our lives more valuable and better, more interesting, any number of other things? And this notion of storytelling, I discovered a long time ago, because I work kind of equally between the arts and the sciences, engineering, that there are in fact two kinds of people in the world. People who think there are two kinds of people and people who don't. But beyond that, I think there really are two different sets of sensibilities, and they're often disconnected. The first sensibility, for lack of another word, is the engineering technologist perspective, which is that of requirements. And you hear the word requirements a lot, we've heard it today. Just tell me what the requirements are, and I will deliver for you an engineered solution. And requirements are useful. Sometimes people approach it by, let's follow people around in their daily lives, observe them, let's do focus groups, let's do a whole bunch of things. And based upon that acquired perspective, we will develop an appropriate engineering solution. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it, which is really more from the storyteller side, is called the big idea. It's saying it's all well and good that you have requirements and all of that, but you're never going to do anything new by asking people what they like or by paying attention to what they do. What we want is the big idea. To Nathan's point, something that's really cool and that will basically change the way everybody think about things. Both of these professionals use intuition. The engineer's intuition is to say what is possible and what you think you can achieve without losing your job. And the big idea people is the intuition of what people will like and what I might be able to do that's unique, but because of my sense of how people work, something they will enjoy and embrace, or else you lose your job. I spoke to a general, I like generals, I spoke to a general a little while back about the notion of requirements, and after a whole career, 38 years of listening to requirements and how it drives the requirements for the Defense Department, he was coming around to thinking, no, maybe it's big ideas, maybe experimentation is important, the ability to just sort of do things and see what comes out. R&D, something which is fading rapidly from the countryside. We do a lot of D, there's not a lot of R going on, and I think it's at our peril. But he woke up one night with the startling revelation that there was no requirement for gunpowder. and that his whole profession really hinged upon what gunpowder started and what all of that, and that, you know, nobody said, gee, we need something that expands rapidly, like a gas, software, or pyrotechnics. And I think that was an excellent point, that there was no requirement. Both of these professionals approach problem solving and are imaginative and are creative and are able to do extraordinary things. But I find it's interesting, the process is so different that trying to describe one's process to the other can be a little like telling someone who's red-green colorblind about the emotional importance of the color red. And you sort of say, red, you know, like blood. And they're thinking, yeah, gray, like blood. And, you know, red, like that fire truck. And they're thinking gray, like the fire truck. And it's difficult because we don't have a particularly good language to cross over between these worlds. I think Gordon's suggestion about how you look into the future is to look back into history is an excellent one. And I think it's interesting if you look back from the perspective of a storyteller, you realize that every time a significant storytelling technology has been introduced to the world, it changed the course of civilization, or rather, we changed the course of civilization with it. And this can be language, it can be writing, it can be printing, it can be radio, television, it can be poetry, it can be animation, and now it's getting to be computers. The moment you introduce a new storytelling technology, because human beings are wired with this compelling need to tell stories to one another, it changes the world. Now, I actually do believe that there are other types of needs that people have in their lives beyond storytelling. Even on the web, you have notions of interactions that are interactive based upon transactions, gaming, information retrieval. But I would argue that if you take the position that a computer is a storytelling device and computer networks are storytelling devices, that you'll do all of those better as well. That storytelling is such a compelling thing that if you do storytelling well in computers, it will let you solve a great deal of those other, I think, simpler problems. I am alarmed that people look at computers of today and think they're okay, and think that we're at a stable stage where this is the good stuff, where, you know, it's just sort of the hardware problem is solved, and now we're moving on to what do you do about software, and as soon as we get rid of those operating systems, everything will be fine. But, you know, basically the hardware problem is solved. Well, I'm here to tell you that it isn't solved, and that the computers we have today are stupid, ugly, unresponsive. If you had friends like this, you would have a very lonely life. Yet somehow or other, we accept them. Why should computers be so ugly? Why should they be so, if there were to be an institute for the aesthetically challenged, I think today's computers would probably be the perfect demonstration project, the perfect example of the sort of system that pays little, if any, attention to what human beings do, how they function, how they relate, and basically says, you, the human, because you're smarter, will learn how to use the computer no matter how awkward that interaction might be. And I think it's actually possible to do that better. And when we look into the future and we look at something like networked computing, which I think is pretty extraordinary, on the famous continuum between citizens band radio on one end, where you have a technology that came and went in about 20 minutes, billion-dollar industry gone, to on the other end, a technology which has served us relatively well, like fire. Still works pretty well, do it pretty much the same way, hasn't come up with anything better to accomplish the same things. On the traditional CB fire continuum, where is the World Wide Web and what it will evolve to? I don't mean the web we have today. Where is it? Is it CB radio or fire? Raise your anthropomorphic paddles. How many of you think it's CB radio, that it's, you know, just like this computer thing, gonna blow over? Okay, how many of you think it's fire? What do the rest of you think? Somewhere in between, odds are. Well, I think the fire ones are right. I think what we're witnessing here is fire, and up until this recent cloning stuff, I think it's probably the most important technology that we've developed to date after storytelling. And storytelling, people like me think is the world's oldest profession, contrary to what you may have heard, is an honorable and serious profession. And incidentally, one that requires the use of a professional to do well. And that's why I think so much of what's being proposed in the way of interactive television, interactive networks, interactive things to do are often highly overrated. Because interactivity isn't a new idea. And you have different classes of interactivity. Passive interactivity, which is what we do, where I'm looking at you, and as I see you glazing over, I might change the subject a bit. Taking advantage of the sensitivities of human interaction, our ability to function as sensor fusers and context parsers, to be able to understand things beyond the direct semantic stream that's being exchanged when I speak. I find there's a lack of appreciation of what the role of professional storytellers are and do. Gordon, and I agree with Gordon, I'm a big implant fan. I think, 50 years implants, you're going to be going down to your local store and get me one of those HD TV implants. But I think and if you noticed, HD TV is still 2 Christmases away, by the way. But I think that it's really interesting when you start looking at the implications of some of these new things from the perspective of a storyteller, because the notion of much of the interactive media, interactive movies, assumes that everybody's good at it. Now, you don't assume this in medicine. If you have chest pains and you go running in a panic to your cardiac specialist, and they say, whoop, bypass, you need a bypass. How many of you have the first instinct to go to Home Depot and get the do-it-yourself cardiac bypass kit, vice grip? You sort of clamp a few on, you do a few things, you pop it off. No, odds are you would trust a professional. When it comes to storytelling, people suspect that, oh, well, I'm just as qualified to tell a story as anyone else is. It isn't true. When you saw Schindler's List, for those of you who saw it, and based on the ratings, a large percentage on television a few weeks ago, if you had at home a little box with a knob that let you dial in happy Nazis, mean Nazis, Nazis that speak Portuguese, a whole collection of different options, it wouldn't make it a better film. The reason Steven Spielberg has paid a great deal of money is because he is a master storyteller. And what master storytellers do is come up with methods to work around the limitations of the communications media that they are given. That is a significant part of the job of being a professional storyteller. It's to understand the audience, to understand how you touch people, how you reach them, how you speak to them, and find ways to get around technical limitations. For the same reason that the path of technology, if you think about it, can in fact be quite predictable, and looking at the various laws governing it, so are people. People's needs have not changed a great deal over the years. And if you're going to be in business, for example, you're in the business of adding value to people's lives. And it's measured, ignoring the spiritual for a moment, by 2 pretty simple metrics. You are competing for people's time and for their money. There's a myth that people have leisure time. Does anyone in this room have leisure time? I have never met anyone who has leisure time, extra time waiting to be filled. One person. And how many of you have spare money? Money you're not doing anything with? Well, if I'm going to successfully compete and bring things into your lives, whether they're network-based or computer-based or whatever-based, I have to take time and money away from other people who are already occupying it. And this whole notion of adding value to people's lives changes. When you're a kid, money seems like the big deal. It's what you're unfortunately often taught is the objective of a significant part of your life. And as you get older, in fact, about 10 minutes before you drop dead, time takes on a whole new meaning. So why is this all happening now? Why is there this fire, this explosion, this exponential growth? If you believe, as I do, that it has to do with storytelling, well, what's changing? Yeah, the technology's getting better. What's different about us? What's different about communities? What's different about people? I think we're seeing a redefinition of community. And the redefinition sometimes takes place on an urban, a city, a suburban basis. The idea that urban planners forget that you need malls, and then they forget that you need town squares rather, and then malls come up to sort of solve that lack. The idea that people come together in communities in cyberspace. That's new. The idea that you can have a community that isn't connected or that people haven't met each other in the same ways. So community is being redefined. There's another phenomena, and that is the generations of kids coming up these days don't think computers are anything special or any big deal. They treat computers like they treat the toilet. It's a part of your life, it's always been there, it has a valuable set of functions, you learn how to use it properly, and it becomes part of your regular life. You are trained on both of them, and your facility with the use of both will affect how you are judged socially and by your friends. I think another thing has happened, that we as a society, when I say society, I mean the society that's more represented in this room, and I realize that it's actually a fairly narrow slice, and I think that's a big problem, and I'd like to talk about that later if there's time. But we are entering the post-Jetsons era. The post-Jetsons era. When I was a kid, growing up, 60s, thereabouts, the vision of the future was the Jetsons. Elroy on the little thing, moving around, apartment houses floating up in the space. The idea that anything synthetic was intrinsically superior to something that grew in the ground or occurred naturally. The idea that the products of technology are by definition superior to naturally originated things. Well, we went through another period, which sort of started in the 70s, late 80s, where the vision of the future became a little house in the country with a lawn and a white picket fence. It was sort of a green view of things. And the idea that the Jetsons was somehow other passé. It was the sort of older model of the future, but the new model of the future had to get back to getting with nature, understanding what people are about. Well, now we're moving beyond that. And we basically want to be is in the little house in the country, but wired. We want to be in the little house in the country with the picket fence, but the picket fence really is something which disguises a phased array antenna, which is tracking all of the low Earth orbit satellites to which we are continuously and permanently wired. What's interesting is that we embrace these technologies because we think they often provide solutions to problems that we have created for ourselves. And that, in fact, we are starting to see some benefits. And no matter how horrible it is, email actually creates an interesting way of socially interacting with people that is different than calling them on the phone or different than doing it in person. In fact, it makes one want to be able to pick up the phone and just leave someone a message, not actually talk to them. How many of you would like to do that? Be able to pick up the phone and just leave a message. I don't want to talk to you, I want to talk to your machine. What I think is happening is we're not really changing a lot, but these networks are changing. When I say these networks, I mean these ideas of interconnected things with some final purpose. Now, what's the purpose? I think one of the big problems that I see about this looking into the future, the next 50-year thing, is that we're often providing really excellent answers to the wrong questions. And I think part of the challenge is asking the correct questions. What matters? What matters from the perspective of people out there like you and me, or the larger community that doesn't come to conferences like that? What's in it for them? The answer to the question, who cares? And as far as I'm concerned, this whole notion of a fundamentally storytelling-based view of the world can get you in big trouble, or it can solve a lot of problems. I think we need new metrics, because we don't have particularly good metrics for how effective storytelling is done. I've been talking recently about the notion of emotional resolution, about the idea of, in a communications medium, that unlike the engineering perspective, which often holds that more resolution is better until you can't afford it anymore, that in storytelling, more resolution is often not better. And in fact, the reason photographers use diffusion filters to knock down the technical performance of their camera systems is because it does a better job of storytelling. The 11-foot diameter nostril with hairs coming out of it, each and every one perfectly resolved, generally generally doesn't create a more meaningful relationship between you, the audience, and the performer. And so understanding this and manipulating is important, but we don't have good ways of talking about that kind of resolution, the emotional resolution. I am a little concerned when I start hearing, for lack of another word, a sort of anti-entertainment fascism starting to emerge. The idea that if something is entertaining, it is intrinsically inferior to something that is serious. The idea that in our schools, somehow or other, knowledge and the process of imparting knowledge to people can't be done in a way that's entertaining, or else it's just simply not as good. Much to the point this morning of, well, you know, the calculators in the schools really didn't destroy the kids, because there's also an anti-technology sort of fascism which occurs, which basically says, well, these things will upset the apple cart and it's basically not good. The fact is, we shouldn't have to apologize for things that are entertaining. One shouldn't have to get up and say, oh, it's entertaining. Once you get done with that, now let's settle down to business and start talking about real information, important information, things that are not purely entertaining, things that are purely what? I mean, what is the condition that entertaining seems to destroy? Storytellers have developed very interesting ways of solving technical problems, as I said before. Just as mathematicians gave us great insight into compression, and one of the things that's sort of a multiplier in communications these days is the ability to compress signals, so that we have now working digital television systems, when 10 years ago, if you'd asked most professionals, the answer was it's a pipe dream. You're never going to do it. You're never going to be able to cram an HD TV signal into 6 megahertz of bandwidth, for example. Well, it turns out you can do it. But you need something better than kind of run length compression, or things which basically just take a purely mathematical view. If you understand something about images and the structure of images and how people perceive them, by techniques such as perceptual coding and techniques which are in the broad category of semantic compression, you can actually squish things down a lot more by basically having a set of rules. And these rules determine how the compression works. Well, I would argue that storytelling allows you to use something called imagination, which is probably the most powerful form of compression that's yet been developed. Rather than holding up to you a high-resolution image of a monster that you're supposed to find scary, were I to be a master storyteller, I would create, with a very few number of words, based upon my knowledge of you being human beings, you having gotten to this point in your lives, and the fact that we have common fears, and we have a whole variety of experiences that make us humans. I could give you a picture of a creature that incidentally exists in the dark. Remember the boogeyman? I mean, there are no pixels at all, just, one, repeat it throughout the entire frame. And that's a pretty highly compressed image. And in fact, what it will do is decrypt, reconstruct, decompress in each of your brains. And each of you may have a completely different monster in your minds, or else you should probably know each other because you have a shared set of experiences that you might enjoy. But that is an extraordinary method of compressing data, to let your imagination do the reconstruction. That's what storytellers do. Many of the problems that we heard discussed this morning, I agree, are deep, complex problems. And what I'm proposing we should spend a little bit more of our time doing is faking it. Yeah, we know it's hard to make machines that are, self-aware. We know it's hard to make machines that think and all that. So just fake it. Go talk to a few storytellers, and just like when you see a movie, the production team faked it. I mean, how often do you think when the people get killed, it's real? We don't do that very often in our business, at least not intentionally. And we fake it. Somehow or other, faking it when it comes to computers and human interfaces is considered cheating. It's sort of like, again, it's this, faking it fascism. Why is it bad to fake it? Why is it better to provide a better experience and better interaction between a person and a machine or other people connected to it by doing a bunch of things that the person on the other end mistakes for being better? It's not really better, but it feels better. Well, that's okay. I maintain that that's actually allowed. When we deal with this room, how many of you, when you walked into this room, which would probably, if we reconstructed it at the resolution that each of you felt was adequate to capture the essence of what's in here, including all of you, how many of you felt overwhelmed by walking into this multi-terabyte database? You said, oh my God, look at all of this data. What am I going to do? No, you probably didn't do that. Because you have an understanding of context, you have an understanding of objects, you have a sense that, oh, it's carpet. You don't have to capture an image of all of the carpet, you just have to say it's carpet. Convention center, it's probably cheap carpet, it isn't wool. Same thing with the wall covering, same people next to you. You can scale the amount of information you need depending upon what's useful to you. We just deal with these things in a way that is good enough for our series of experiences, but at the same time, not necessarily essential to be real. When I came over here, I passed 1 million trees, arguably, driving over, and I didn't remember that as tree, 0 through just under 1 million. I remembered it as, gee, lots of trees. Now, if I had seen one of those pine trees upside down, balanced on its point, roots in the air, this is mathematically a pretty trivial change, 180-degree geometric rotation of one element in a set of 1 million. That disappears into the noise in many ways of looking at things, but because it violated my context, my notion of common sense of the way the world works, it would become completely memorable to me and anyone else who saw it. Just as a little gray rock, which someone shows me and says, oh, it's a little gray rock, and what's so special? Oh, this is one of those moon rocks with the first signs of life or something like in it. That rock becomes very different. An old piece of wood. What is this piece of wood? It's a piece of the original cross. Now, whether I believe it or not, the fact that there is story associated with it, and the fact that the person showing it to me may or not believe it, but they had a reason for telling me that, affects the whole interaction. It contextualizes my sense of what this is. This fits into an extraordinary notion of human beings, and that is our ability to deal with abstraction. How is it that you can look at an animated cartoon and an animated character can make you cry? Why is that? What is our ability to be able to take an abstract notion like an animated character? I mean, when Bambi's mom bit the big one, did it bother you? I mean, it was a difficult experience for a lot of people, terrifying for some. And how can that be? How can a series of flat two-dimensional pieces of art make you think that way? How can flickering phosphors on a television make you think that you're seeing something real? Abstraction is a great thing for human beings. Unfortunately, it's also why we accept bad computers and bad interactions. It's because even though it's abstract and weird, we can still accept it. I think interoperability is essential. What enabled our civilization to take off was very simply the notion that language was developed and made us able to interoperate in a way that we never could before. And I think that is something which you can't underestimate the value of. Standardization is useful but gets you in big trouble. Cars, the fact that we standardized where the wheel is, that was important. Useful. At the same time, if you took an engineer standardization approach to designing a symphony orchestra, you first get a committee together to design the perfect instrument, and then once you have that instrument capable of making every range of sound you need, you get 100 of them, put them in with a network so they all operate effectively. Well, there are other ways to do it. You can do things like say, well, we need time synchrony, let's get a conductor, we need little wind instruments, we need percussive instruments, and we have a notion of musical scoring which lets these all interoperate together. This is sort of why the World Wide Web works. There isn't an IS person alive on the face of the earth who would tell you you could connect PCs and Macs and Unix machines and have them all interoperate, sending high-quality visuals, non-ASCII things all over the world, reloading their own software, and it was done without an IS person being anywhere in sight. Maybe there is some relationship. I think it's important not to be confused by thinking intuitive interfaces are good. For the very simplest, most basic tasks, intuitive is good. I've heard so far of people I've talked to, people talking about the intuitive computer interface as the holy grail. I've never seen a high-performance task, whether it's driving a racing car or playing a violin or dancing or almost anything else, that is intuitive. Language isn't intuitive, you have to learn it. The fact is, high-performance human tasks have to be learned The issue is to provide an interface which is capable of being learned and then allows you to do extraordinary things. And that doesn't necessarily mean intuitive, and I think it's important to know the difference. Natural human interfaces, absolutely critical for the future. I'm almost out of time, so what I want to do is just tell you a couple of things. I want to remind you that thinking about these notions of what's after television, of like the internet is going to replace television, is not important. That is not an interesting question, because it either means you're thinking of television as the wiring that gets it to you, and that's not what television is about, or it means that you're thinking that there's something intrinsically inferior about linear storytelling, and the fact that you give someone an interactive medium, an active interactive medium, will fundamentally change that process of relating complex ideas to people. Don't think that's going to happen. Clearly, natural interfaces like language, implants, and these things are going to happen. Clearly, the systems are going to, and here's the prediction part, they're going to start understanding the subtleties of what it's like to be a human being. They're going to understand timing. Dramatic pause. They're going to understand intonation, accent, gaze, perspiration, all of the things that we sensor-fusing, context-parsing human beings use to exchange complex thoughts. Computers are going to be able to do this. There are going to be emotional overlays, so that fear, joy, anger, all of this is going to be constantly overlaid in how the information is transferred. You're going to have next generation representations. When I say next generation, none of this nonsense of sort of little dumb icons. I mean, shouldn't an icon that represents something on your desktop that could get you fired look different than something that can't? But they don't. Shouldn't we have some sense that we, human beings, as sensor fusers, should be communicated with in more ways than simple 2D representations or things that require joysticks and mice to interact with? We are very good at being able to deal with a complex flow of information. And part of the challenge is to get the machines to be able to feed that information to us so we're not seeing the whole world through a soda straw. Your machine needs to be aware and have a history with you. That's critical. It needs to be aware that human beings have more than 5 senses. Where did this come from? 5 senses. I mean, if you show me a human being with 5 senses, I will show you someone that's handicapped. Even in the standard 5 senses that are taught to kids in school, they ignore temperature. What's temperature? Chopped liver? I mean, that's not touch, that's not smell, that's not other things. Everything that we teach kids about this is largely wrong, and everything that we are setting in the way of expectations are often so limiting that people aren't thinking to the next step. Computers will be joyful, attractive, aesthetically pleasing objects. They will be something that you wouldn't feel you have to cover up when someone comes into a house. They'll be nice to touch. They'll be nice to see. They'll be part of you. We will clearly have local simulation, meaning the notion that a significant part of the process is running locally in your computer and being constructed for you in real time. Not only do I think that we're going to have intelligent machines in 50 years, I think we're going to be beyond intelligent machines. I think the important part from the perspective of storytelling is we're going to have self-aware machines that are also aware of you. About 20 minutes from now, we could fake some of this, and I think it's worth trying. But by 50 years, we will have self-aware machines. And we will have machines that understand that they are storytellers. We will have storytelling engines embedded in every computer. It will be as common as a math coprocessor to have a story engine in it. We are going to have to understand that some of these things that are killing the web at the moment, like it's really ugly, will get you through the novelty stage, but have to get better quickly. The questions of latency. Bandwidth is a synthetic notion created by engineers. You don't want wideband, you don't want narrowband, you want invisible bandwidth. You want enough bandwidth to do what you have to do at any given moment. You can adaptively change it. It might be a T7000 one day and, basically 110 baud the next day. Doesn't matter. It should be invisible to you. This notion of trust, which Patty mentioned, is critical. But I disagree with her a little. I don't think it's about trusting your computer, because it's easy to learn to trust machines. You trust your automobile. If you knew how most of them were built, you wouldn't, but you tend to trust your automobile. What you realize is when you put it in the context of being a human being, and you think about the human being and the technical system as one, and I think to not do that, we are at our peril. But you realize the danger of driving is not the automobile or a wheel falling off, it's the other people out there on the road. And that's going to be the danger of cyberspace and the net. Establishing trust means you will put your money, your reputation, your life, the welfare of your children out onto the web. I don't think you will ever have ubiquitous trust, but I think you will be able to carve out areas of trust, and that's going to be a noble profession. And I hope many of you are taking that seriously. Because once we have communities of computers interoperating with each other, self-aware computers talking to other self-aware computers, ganging up on us, it's important that we have a sense of trust that overlays that, so that basically we feel that this extended community is a community that we can depend upon, that it won't hurt us. I just want to say one final thing, because I am absolutely convinced that the biggest single challenge we have over the next 50 years that overrides all others is that of educating our children. I hope every single one of you is embarrassed at the state you have allowed education to decline in this country. It is shocking, and there is no problem that we face, whether it's drugs or crime or anything else, that is beginning to be as important as this notion of education, and it all stems from it. I spoke to kids at an elementary school the other day, and I asked them, which do you think is more sophisticated? And I showed them a Ferrari, and I showed them a horseshoe crab. Every one of them thought the Ferrari was more sophisticated, a more technologically advanced thing. We've got to stop people from thinking this way. We've got to get them to understand that X numbers of millions of years of evolution has produced a machine that is infinitely more sophisticated than the Ferrari. They don't understand this. We're teaching them the opposite. We must learn to build teams which take the skills of the engineers and the computer scientists and the technologists. And many of you people out there are the jewels of our civilization. Your thinking represents the hope to solve and address a bunch of these things. At the same time, there's another set of professionals out there called the storytellers. And the time has come in the evolution of computing to merge these two together. It shouldn't be acceptable that the most advanced technology in any inner city school today is the metal detectors that frisk kids for weapons when they go into the classroom. We are at a stage, and if any of you think I'm talking about replacing teachers with computers and all, I think that's nonsense. It's not to understand what a teacher does. But I think the extraordinary window that network computing technology can give our kids in our classrooms on the world can provide power steering for teachers. The idea of mentor engines also being embedded in computers, things which understand what a teacher and a mentor does and learns how to get the humans to do that. Power steering for teachers, power steering for artists, for creative people, the sort of thing that gives them a new way of reaching a larger number of people more effectively. If you combine the skills of the technologists and of the engineers with those of the storytellers, and by that I mean the whole range of storytellers. It can be people who write, it can be fine artists, painters, poets, it doesn't matter. You combine those together, and I think for the first time you have a combination that will reliably be able to reach out to the kids of tomorrow. I think by this technology, these two technologies combined, storytelling and network computing, you have the ability to touch people's hearts. If you can touch their hearts, you can open their minds, and by opening their minds, you can change the world. If we do that successfully, this really will be remembered as the storytelling age and the time where we decided to take our collective future seriously. Thank you for listening.